What I'd like to talk about next is how the feudal system relates to the creation of art in the so-called Middle Ages or Dark Ages of Europe. Now, you'd think that the king would be in the picture more, but that's actually a sort of myth. It isn't until Charlemagne comes along much later that the king is really in control of a lot of stuff. I want you to think of this as a series of isolated little city-states that really have no relationship to one another and really have no relationship to Rome. There's a complete breakdown of European systems and trade routes and things like that that really happens just after the the Roman Empire falls apart. And so by around 400 or 500 Common Era, you have a series of little areas that spring up that you have, for instance, you might have someone who is rich or wealthy and they create a monastery. And these are farmers who own a lot of land and they create a little monastery. You also have small landowners who own plots of land, who own farms, and they're free people who formerly in the Roman Empire would have had some sort of authority and might have even been citizens at the time. But then they really have no protection, and the monasteries have some protection, but not too much. And some of the monasteries and some of the sort of small farms, you have someone who becomes very powerful and becomes what we refer to now as a noble, but they're really a lord who is someone who has enough resources to create a small private army for himself, and he develops a protection racket. The freemen and serfs, who are more or less working the land, they need the knights and the lord's protection to make sure that marauders and people who are coming through the landscape trying to steal their stuff don't get in. And one of the ways that they can pay back the Lord to, for his small army and for his protection is to ask the Lord to do this, and they will give him in exchange some labor. And one of the labors that they might provide is to work on the Lord's property for a little bit. The other way that they might do this is actually to give one of the sons over so that he can become a knight or a soldier. And then the other way is that if they can't afford to give up one of the kids, and you got to think there's a 70 to 80% infant mortality rate, and very often people didn't live very long, what you would do then is you would give crops and you would give products of your farm to the Lord. And eventually, after a while, the lords start signing charters and start signing agreements with these peasants that bind the peasants to the land and bind the generations of peasants that come after to work on this land. And the Lord actually kind of owns the land, and the peasant is not free to leave. Eventually, what kind of happens with some of the peasants is they flee to the towns. And the towns can often, if you live in the town for a year or so, you're considered a free man. But in general, you're kind of a runaway slave if you flee to a town, and the Lord might even send someone looking for you. Now, one of the things that evolves out of this is that there's this sort of synergy and a protection racket that includes the monasteries as well. And the monasteries often are sort of in cahoots with the lords and with the people who are the protection racket. And what they do is they provide goods to the Lord, and they also educate the Lord's children. And they also provide goods like written records, manuscripts. Sometimes they brew beer and other forms of alcohol like brandy and wine. And they sometimes even provide food, and the Lord in exchange gives them protection. And often the Lord's children will also go to the monastery and be part of the monastery and be hooked up with the church or the monastery. So one of the main products of the monastery happens to be manuscripts and Bibles. And they also copied out old texts that were being lost because, a lot of the texts were written on papyrus and other forms of paper that were starting to fall apart at this point in time. So the churches and the monasteries copied these things out. But the main thing that they like to work on, because it was a form of devotion, would be manuscripts that were biblical manuscripts or actually devotional manuscripts. So we're going to look at those first. Now, this is a Byzantine manuscript, and it was probably made in Syria or somewhere in Palestine in the 6th century. And it's called the Vienna Genesis. And it depicts a scene of Jacob wrestling the angel and the story of Jacob wrestling the angel. You have to look at it first and see that it's a fairly small size. It's about 9 by 12, so it's the size of a small notebook that we would have today. And it's made on vellum, which is animal hide, and it's purple dyed. It uses a combination of different kinds of materials. For instance, it uses tempera, which is usually egg yolk mixed with some kind of pigments, and that binds the pigments to the paint and glues the paint to the page. That's the medium. Often there's gold and gold leaf and silver paint on it. And they also sometimes will dye the animal skin, the vellum. And this is a very sturdy kind of book, and that's why it's still alive or still around today. Now, the actual text at the top of it, which is written in Greek, is a summary of the story of Jacob wrestling the angel. It's not actually a complete biblical account. It's not the Bible in complete detail, and it's written in Greek. That is also important because the Bible often starts out in Greek and then it gets translated later on into Latin, and it goes through all these different incarnations from Hebrew to Greek to Latin. And so it's a game of telephone with the past where things are reinterpreted. And in this instance, since it's a summary of the stories, I'm sure that it's missing some crucial elements to original early Bibles. Now, the other thing that this manuscript or this Bible contains is an illustration at the bottom of the page that's done in tempera paint. And it's done as a continuous kind of scene or a continuous narrative. And the story itself, the reason why this story is significant, why it was told in such detail in this manuscript, is it's a kind of typological exegesis. And a typological exegesis is a story that relates to an Old Testament story that tells a story that is very similar to the stories concerning the figure of Jesus later on in the New Testament. Because calligraphy is kind of a secondary concern in this, I think probably the most important concern really is the depiction of the story. And this story is a sort of type of story that relates to a later story in the New Testament and has to do with forgiveness and the idea of letting go of sin and letting go of a grudge, which is kind of the philosophy that Jesus espouses, where you forgive your enemies. So the story of Jacob and Esau is that Jacob is the second-born son of Isaac, and Esau is his older brother, but they are actually fraternal twins, not identical twins. And in the Bible, it's described that Jacob was born grasping the heel of Esau. And so the story is that Jacob is born just a couple of minutes after Esau, and Esau wins all of the rights. All of the birthrights and wins all of the blessings and that kind of thing. However, Jacob and Esau's mother decides that she prefers Esau, who's kind of a small sort of mama boy kind of character. And Esau is the older guy who is hairy, and he's a hunter, and he's a sort of macho kind of guy. And the story unfolds that eventually, because Jacob is this mama's boy who really loves his mom and sticks close to her, he is always at home, and he is sort of the person who stays close to home and doesn't go out into the wild. And Esau is the hunter who goes out into the wild. We have a scene in the story in which Esau comes back home, and he has been out hunting for days, and he's starving, and his brother is making a pot of beans, a pot of lentils. And Jacob makes a deal with Esau, since Esau is starving, that if you sell me your birthright, Esau, I will give you this pot of beans, this pot of lentils. It sounds almost like Jack and the Beanstalk, right? Now, a contract made under duress like that in terms of Jewish law is considered invalid, and it's also kind of an unfair thing, and I think that's part of the lesson that's being taught in the Bible in this instance. But nevertheless, Esau consents to agree to this. And so what eventually happens is, when his father is dying, Isaac actually calls Esau in as he's about to die to confer the final blessing. And Isaac is already blind. So then what happens is Isaac's wife ushers in Jacob and says, here, I'm going to put some lamb's wool on your arms so that you feel hairy like Esau, and so that when your father puts his hands on your arms, he'll know that you have actually, that it's Esau and not Jacob. So Jacob actually comments on this. You sound like Jacob, but your arms feel like Esau, and so he confers the final blessing and then dies. Well, of course, Esau is going to be very angry about this, so Jacob flees and he goes away and he ends up becoming very prosperous. In his prosperity, he decides eventually that he needs to really get back and to his family and become friends with his brother again and make up. So he actually sends gifts ahead and writes to Esau and says, Esau, I'd like to make it up to you. Can I come back home? And Esau consents to it. And that's where this painting begins. Jacob is coming home and he is going to meet his brother Esau. And along the road, he meets up with this mysterious character. And it's not really clear who this character is. Even if you read the Bible, you're not really sure. But it's often interpreted that it's actually the Archangel Michael. So Jacob meets Michael on the road. And we see that in the upper register of this sort of swoop. And as they are traveling back to meet up with his brother, one night Jacob and the angel, Michael, wrestle. And what happens is they come to a standstill. They come to a draw. And the angel says, what do you want from me? And Jacob says, can you give me a blessing? And the angel blesses Jacob and renames him Israel or Israel. And then he takes off and he goes back. And we can see here in the bottom scene that he is traveling back. And so we have this sort of like reverse C shape of the story. It's a continuous narrative that all of the story is being told in one continuous plane. But it's not reading left to right. It's sort of leading left to right and then right to left on the bottom there. And it's a kind of U shape or a C shape on its side. And we can see that Jacob has received the blessing. Now, the main ideas behind me talking about this is it's a continuous narrative. But the formal issues of how manuscript painting looks at this point in time in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries is it's very flat. The drapery is kind of cartoon-like. They're not really lifelike figures. It's more of a diagram or a cartoon that is meant to portray the story as clearly as possible, and they're not really interested in illusionism. And you can actually see that the characters in the entourage are overlapping one another, that the anatomy is not really well done. Although at some points you can actually see they're making a nod or a reference back to contrapposto. There's no deep space, there's no layering, there's no light and shadow like we might have seen in Roman art, especially in Pompeii and the frescoes. Well, this style is actually probably ties in a lot with the Arch of Constantine and the ideas that we talked about with that, where Christian art is first and foremost meant to be didactic. It's meant to communicate a message and tell the story clearly, and they're not interested in it being beautiful because this world is not a great world. The world of heaven is actually better, so you better get right with God. And the art is basically just for instruction. It's not meant to entertain or to be beautiful. We see that kind of idea in this next icon or altarpiece that we're looking at. It's about 27 by 18 inches, and it's painted with a wax-based paint called encaustic. And encaustic paint is just basically wax is the glue that holds the paint to the surface of the wood that it's painted on. So you get these ground up minerals or other kinds of colorants that are mixed in with wax while it's still hot and melted, and you literally sort of burn it or melt it onto the surface, and you can get a nice variation of grays, of tonal variations and things like that with this. And we have here an altarpiece in which the Virgin and Child are flanked by saints and angels. And this is going to be a schema or a standard kind of image that we're going to be seeing for centuries after this. So in the first part, what I want you to notice is that it's not entirely realistic, but it still has a little bit of the old Roman feeling of painting things with a little bit of light and shadow, especially in Mary's drapery. However, when you look a little bit more closely, the anatomy is quite bad, and the two saints on either side are almost not standing with any kind of weight. There's no contrapposto. They're almost kind of floating. The faces are done in a very Byzantine style, where the nose is elongated, the eyes seem a little too high up in the forehead, and the mouth is a little too low to the chin. The eyes are a little bit too large, because this is the standard Byzantine style of portraying figures. We have Jesus seated on the lap of Mary, and all of the important figures, including the angels, have halos. And this is a kind of trope or a motif that we're going to see, which is a virgin enthroned. The Virgin Mary seated on a throne, and on her lap is the infant Jesus. And this turns into a motif or a theme that runs into the later periods of the Romanesque and the Gothic period, which is called the throne of wisdom theme, which is the Virgin enthroned, and on her lap is the child Jesus, who learns all of his wisdom from his mother. And I kind of like to think of this as almost like the Jewish mother kind of story, where I'm just a piece of furniture, oh my God, you don't care about me, I'm just furniture to you. And in a way, that's what the Virgin kind of is. She's the vessel of God. So she's first and foremost kind of almost a human being who gives birth to Jesus, in some ways almost against her will. And then when she raises Jesus, she teaches him morality. So she's an instrument of God, almost a tool in a way, and on which Jesus learns his earthly wisdom and how to behave like a good person. If you notice in this image, Mary is seated in the center, and in some ways she's also even slightly larger in scale. Her head is slightly bigger than the other characters that surround her, because she is the most important character. She is got sort of these supporting figures, the saints on the left and the right, and then behind her are these angels that are almost like the cheerleaders that are supporting her on her throne. And so this is a typical kind of image that would have been used in a church, and icon making, and this is where we get the term iconography, is a typical kind of pursuit of monasteries, and it was a way of making art that glorified God. Now, you might have heard about the iconoclastic controversy that comes a little bit later, and so let me just address this for a minute. The reason why Catholics feel it's okay to make religious art and to make images of the Virgin and Jesus and the saints is basically because it's considered to be educational. It's meant to be didactic, even though the second commandment says you shouldn't make a graven image. Now, the second idea behind this then is that you want to make sure that these images are still kind of cartoon-like and that you couldn't confuse them with real life. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this sort of Byzantine caricaturish style, because it's not very naturalistic. The other thing that is very important is that the elements in the picture are meant to support the central message to it. And so we have a symmetrical composition with the most important figure in the center, and that calls attention compositionally to the Virgin Mary and her son, who is the center of the very image and the center of Christianity. Now, the next idea that I think is kind of important to talk about with Catholic religious art is that sometimes people who are a little anti-Catholic say that they worship idols and that they're breaking the second commandment. And for instance, they pray to saints, and that is almost kind of pantheistic in a way, and that they're not really being they're kind of being polytheistic, that they're worshiping many gods. They're not. When you pray to a saint or you pray to the Virgin Mary, if you're Catholic, you're actually asking her to go and talk to God for you. You're asking that figure of that saint, or you're asking Mary, who has basically the ear of God, that you're asking their spirit to go and put in a good word with you, with Jesus and with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. So it's not actually that they're praying to the saints, even though they phrase it that way. What they're doing is they're asking the saint to go talk to God on their behalf. There are a lot of ideas about monasteries and some of the corruption in monasteries that I think are important to talk about. And one of the things that happens really basically in the late 800s, 878 to about 942, is that there's corruption in the monasteries. People are having sex there. They are even monks and nuns are sort of not really paying attention to the basic teachings of Jesus. And so a bishop comes along, and this bishop called Saint Odo comes along, and he decides that he is going to institute a series of reforms, and we call the reforms the Cluniac reforms. The Cluniac reforms, in a sort of nutshell, that they evolve later on, even to the present day, are the idea that you really need to have a church and a monastery that is a holy place, because the lords who are running around, who really make war and killing people, which is sort of anti-Christian, an important part of their everyday pursuit, they need someone to pray on their behalves. And so what they start to think of is the monastery as this sort of prayer machine in which they actually ask the people who live in the monastery to pray on their behalf continuously, and therefore somehow they will be able to intercede on their behalf, because these people have had to make war on other people and break the Ten Commandments. And so monasteries sort of become an indulgence in a way that we'll later on talk about during the Renaissance, in which if you support a monastery and you support the priests and the nuns and the monks who pray in it, and the creation of monastic books and manuscripts and that kind of thing, what will happen then is that eventually their prayers will be sent up to God, and they will protect you, and they will keep you out of hell for a while, or keep you out of purgatory. And so by supporting the church, you're actually sort of paying at the front end for all of the sins that you have made. And the Cluniac reforms then are really instituted maybe mostly by the nobles who support Bishop Odo, who wants to reform the church for very pragmatic reasons, because they want to go to heaven. Now let's take a closer look at some of the monasteries. This is a model of St. Gallen, which is a Benedictine abbey, which is one of those reformed monasteries from St. Gallen, Switzerland, between the 7th and 8th centuries. And we're looking at a plan of it, and we're looking at a model of it. And what I want you to notice about it, we're going to zoom in on some of these things, is the monastery is basically a little acropolis. It's a mini city that contains lots of stuff that would really help them to be able to maintain themselves physically, and also do the things spiritually that they need to do in order to do that. And it would have sometimes even been enclosed by a wall. And the reason why we have this manuscript left over, why we know what this monastery looked like in the 7th and 8th century, was because someone did a drawing of it on the back of a manuscript page, and we've been able to extrapolate from that and kind of figure out what monasteries look like. If you look at the center of it, you have the church is the largest structure, and then it's surrounded by a bunch of buildings that really support the church in the center. And so we're going to zoom in a little bit on it. And the first thing that I want you to notice is that the church is this sprawling structure that's really made more or less in the Roman-esque style / late Roman style. It's a big, almost fortress-like structure that probably had a raised center, a raised nave that allowed a little bit of light to come in. And it has a crossing transept on it, which means that it's kind of a Latin cross plan. The buildings around it are actually, surprisingly enough, very secular. They have to do with the production of goods, and it's almost like a capitalist factory in a way, with God at the center of it, and God is the main motivation for it. So let's zoom in a little bit on some of the floor plans that have to do this, and we'll start at the top of the monastery. If you look at the very top of this plan, which is just a reconstruction from the original drawing, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner that you have herbs and medical herb gardens, and you have actually a physician's house. And one of the things, so it's basically like a high school campus where you have a school nurse, but in this instance you have doctors there. And the doctor's main way of curing people were through herbs. And if that didn't work, if the physician couldn't cure you with herbs, what they would do then is they would sort of drain some of your blood, and that's why we have the bloodletting facility. And the bloodletting facility is basically what they believed is that if you were ill, you had an excess of some kind of energy, and they refer to that as humors. And so if you took some of the blood out of a person, you could actually drain some of the illness out of them and some of the bad energy. Then if you notice to the right of that, you actually have a sort of mini monastery in a way, where you have sleeping rooms surrounding a main chapel with several altars on it, because praying several times a day would be very important. And so what you want to have is a place where the sick can get to this altar and get into the chapel, and that they can also pray for their own souls. And you have a bunch of supporting buildings, for instance, bathrooms and kitchens that are centered around that little miniature area. To the right of that, we have a cemetery and an orchard. So the dead bodies actually were part of the cemetery, but also were used to fertilize the trees. And an orchard would be really important because you would need to have fresh fruit in order to maintain the health of people. To the right of that, we have a vegetable garden. And we even have servants and gardeners living on this. So the monks and the priests and the nuns who lived in these areas would have been supported literally by servants and by workers who were free men or serfs who decided to go and work for this monastery. We also have fresh meat, a source of fresh meat. The geese and the hens are on either side of the fowl keeper's house. If we move down and move to the center of the image, you see that it's basically dominated by the church. And the church in the center of it has two towers that they would use to call people to worship. It has a series of altars inside of it. And then to the left of the church, we have, again, servants' quarters. We also have several places for people to live. For instance, the abbot, who would be living there and part of his storage room. We also have scriptoriums, which is basically above a library where monks, as a form of devotion and also as a form of economics, they would be copying out ancient Roman classical manuscripts and Greek manuscripts, but they also would copy out Bibles and make books of hours. Beneath that, you have a school. So one of the functions of the church was to educate the nobles, especially, and wealthy people. And then you also have a guest house complete with a kitchen and a brewery and a bakery. We also have the brewery and the bakery in other places as well. On the right-hand side of the image, you can actually see that they have a bakery and a brewery, and they very often, the brewery and the bakery are located next to a mill because you need to grind up the flour for both the beer and for the bread that they would be making. You also have some other structures scattered throughout there. For instance, you have someone who is in charge of making pottery. You have metal workers where coopers and turners were there. You have people who make other forms of alcohol, and you also have various pens which contain animals like sheep, goats, cows, and swine. And I think what's also kind of interesting is the servants live right next to the animals. We don't know what the building in the lower left-hand corner is. But the overall picture that I want you to get from this is that this is a typical monastery, and notice that they provide for all of the physical needs that someone would have, including health and food and making food sources, that kind of thing, and also educating people and also praying for them. So this is basically a sort of God factory, if you will.